So welcome again, everyone, to the second module. How is climate change affecting my supply chain? Last week, we already covered the first one, an introduction to climate change. So next, please, Mark. Next slide.
Yep.
Thank you. So today with me is Mark Lundy, who you already seen in his work environment. He is going to present to us today the webinar focusing on climate change. He works for CIA, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. Mark, where are you based?
Cali, Colombia.
Aha, so he's in Colombia. And
drinking coffee, appropriately enough.
With me is also Catherine Selangia. Hi, Catherine. And myself. Unfortunately, Keely was not able to join today. Next, please. So let's look at our agenda. Shortly, I'm going to introduce one more time the online learning series. I've done that already last week, but I see we have a few different participants and additional ones. So I'll quickly run through that. Then we'll go into the content of the risk profiles, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Next, please. Before we start, I would like to familiarize yourself a little bit with Zoom, how that works. So that's the technology we're using for this webinar. In the question and answer session, you could either raise your hand and then we will, and you can speak when we unmute you. Otherwise, you can also use the question and answer box to put your question in there, and I hope we will be able to answer all of them. Otherwise, throughout the webinar, you will be muted. And please remember that this webinar is being recorded because we share it on our website so that people who were not able to participate today can look at it later. And we will also share the presentation. Next, please. So running quickly through how this came up. Last year, we learned there are quite a few questions. Starting the Collective Action Network Climate Smart Agriculture, we learned that there are still quite a few questions on climate change and how it affects coffee and what's already available and what can be done. So we thought we put together a learning series together with the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, whose partners you see here as logos under the Alliance for Resilient Coffee. GCP also partnered with a few other organizations to develop a climate catalog, which we will bring to you later in the year. It's under development. And next, please. Looking at the objectives one more time of this learning series, it's really for the participants to understand climate change and what the issues are, but also be then able to plan and implement and scale effective climate smart agricultural practices. It's learn to assess the risks in your supply chain and convey the value also of the investment into climate smart agriculture into your organization, in your company, or also to work together with others. Where is this all leading? You see it to the right. It's align your actions and hopefully with others. And with that, we are going to help you, of course. Next, please. So looking quickly at the path of this learning series, last week we covered understanding climate change. It was an introduction to terminology. Today, we're going to focus on risk profiles, how climate change is affecting the supply chain. We then, going further in the sequence of providing or showing which tools are already available and have been tested. Moving then, how can CSA be scaled? And then, of course, you also would like to monitor it. Moving on, then the last two modules in what is the business case, and also how does collaboration work and with whom to collaborate. Next, please. So all these modules and their sequence make good sense, and we hope you have time to join them all. However, with these modules, the work of climate smart agriculture is not done. So there's still a lot of research that needs to be done and practices further to be scaled and developed and improved. But certainly this learning series will build your understanding, and hopefully you will start to design projects or programs and enable you to act. Additionally, the Alliance for Resilient Coffee and the Global Coffee Platform is working to bring to you two examples in Honduras and Uganda for collective action. Next, please. What does that mean exactly? So we are going to we're working on that already, aligning with national coffee platforms in Honduras and Uganda to put together an opportunity we're going to bring to you later and also show you throughout the learning series the progress of that. It's going to be an opportunity for many organizations to join our companies, so it's a multi-stakeholder collaboration. Learnings and results will be shared in the sector, and the progress will also be measured. So bear with us while we are progressing in Honduras and Uganda to develop these and bringing them or offering them for collective contribution then later in the learning series. Next, please. Yeah, one more time and a quick overview of all the experts that I'm very proud are ready to contribute to this learning series, and you will hear throughout the various modules during the year. Next, please. So, Mark, I hand over with this introduction to you to tell us something about risk profiles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolina. So, just going back to where we are in the webinar series, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be. So last week we had the presentation on understanding climate change in the coffee sector. Today we're talking about how is climate change affecting my supply chain, and the next seminar or webinar will be on how can I manage the effects of climate change on my supply chain. The learning objectives for today are fairly straightforward. We want to look at how climate change is already affecting coffee production, understand how risk profiles and climate suitability maps can be used, understand some initial ideas about farmer resilience, and begin to understand how to manage climate risk in relation to farmer resilience in your supply chain. So here we're talking about sort of understanding the connection between risk profiles and tailored interventions to specifically reduce risk in your supply chain. We've taken this kind of a view of risk. I believe it was presented a bit last week by Kate in her seminar, but we've basically broken risk out into supply and reputational risks. And today we're going to be focusing more on the supply side, where we'll be looking at areas where climate change will have specific impact in the coffee sector. So we're talking about the area that's available for coffee production. We're talking about increasing temperatures and changing rainfall patterns. And we're talking about varieties that could be poorly suited for future climates. And these obviously all generate a level of risk for supply. To a lesser degree, also, climate is important in terms of pest and disease pressure. So here we're talking about as climate changes, the climate can become more amenable to certain pests and diseases. Think coffee leaf rust in Central America. And obviously that's something to keep in mind as well, although not the principal focus of the conversation today. The other issues here we're not going to be covering specifically in this webinar, but happy to take questions at the end related to these kind of topics. So just to start, I always start with this picture because I think it's important. We're talking about the future of coffee, but we're also talking about the future of the people who grow coffee. And so when we talk about climate change, we're talking about a long-term, cumulative, often slow-moving problem that affects the livelihoods of many, many millions of people globally. Obviously the coffee producers, but also other people in the supply chain, ending, of course, with the roasters and finally the consumers or clients of coffee. So at the end of the day, we really hope to develop a better future, a more resilient future, both for the coffee tree that Marianita is holding, as well as for her and eventually her family and her children. So there is a very technical aspect to this, which we'll discuss. But at the end of the day, we're talking about an endeavor that involves many, many millions of people globally, and for whom we're hoping to build sustainable livelihoods. So I think that's what brings us all together around this important challenge. So in terms of climate, many of you have probably seen these kind of maps, and I'm going to give you a lot of maps during this presentation, but nonetheless, you'll have a copy and you can look at them. What we've done, what these maps show at a global scale is how suitable are current areas of coffee production for coffee. Up in the upper left, you have Central America. The bottom, then moving to the right, you have basically Africa. Then the bottom left, you have Brazil, and the bottom right, you have Indonesia and the Pacific. So this is where we are now. And this is where it's projected to happen in terms of suitability going through 2050. To put that into a clearer vision, this is what it looks like with red and orange being negative and blue and green being positive. So at a global scale, what we're seeing are significant projections of reduced area for Arabica production through about 2050. If we look at it in a different way, we can look at the different areas of production, different countries here, and you can see basically their projections going forward. This is 0. So anything below that line is a loss in coffee production area, Arabica coffee production area, and anything above that line is a gain. So you can see that the vast majority of coffee producing countries globally will see a reduction in the areas that are currently suitable for Arabica production if we do nothing. Now, climate change is something that we talk about often in the future, but it's something that we're already beginning to see impacts. And again, you probably have seen these in your supply chain, and I won't belabor the point, but I think it's important to just mention them. So we already discussed this briefly, coffee leaf rust, something that had a major impact in Central America in the recent past. You know, there's a lot of discussion about this, but there is some evidence indicating that the severity of the coffee leaf rust outbreak may have relations to differences between diurnal and nocturnal temperatures. Another pest and disease that we've seen is the coffee borer beetle. And this, again, as temperatures warm, the coffee borer beetle becomes much happier. We become less happy, but the beetle becomes very happy and begins to wreak much more havoc on production. In some areas, such as data from Tanzania, we see a decrease in yields of about 137 kilograms per hectare for every 1 degree rise in temperature. So this leads us, not only us, but it leads us to farmers and everyone in the supply chain being concerned about what exactly is the future of coffee. What can we do? What should we do? What makes sense to do where and when? And what can we effectively pay for? So the other thing that's important is that these effects that we're seeing are not consistent or blank. They don't affect in a common manner all of the areas of coffee. So if we take a look just briefly at Honduras, these are climate trends over about the last 30 years or so. And you can see that the graphs down on the right hand side, the bottom part, show tremendous variations across the regions of coffee production in Honduras, with some regions becoming hotter and drier, some becoming hotter and wetter, some receiving less rainfall during the dry season, some receiving more rainfall during the wet season. And this is all happening in a, relatively speaking, small geographic area. So climate change is having the 3 effects listed on the left, but they're not uniformly applied across all of the geographies. So what that leads us to conclude, at least with some of these maps, are a few key messages that I think are important for everyone. First, climate change is not something that's going to happen in 2050. It's not something that that may or may not happen, despite what some politicians may think. climate change effects are happening here, they're happening now, and we can see them in many of the coffee lands where we work. Secondly, climate change is not uniform. It varies over space and time, and therefore we need to come up with tailored adaptation strategies. What works in certain regions will not work in others, and what we need to do in areas that are relatively well-positioned vis-a-vis climate change is different than what we need to do in areas that face much greater risk. And third, I think, and perhaps a bit of good news here, is the projections that these maps are built on are based on what are called the business as usual scenario. So if we do nothing, the projected results of climate on Arabica coffee are the ones that I've shown. But that doesn't mean that we should do nothing. There are actually things we can do that can help to reduce the impacts of climate change and to extend the productivity or the productive life of coffee plantations. So what kind of things can we do? And I think this is important. So rather than becoming paralyzed by the scary maps, I think the first thing we need to do is just keep calm and carry on. Don't freak out. Don't run away. Don't decide that coffee is dead and we're going to go do something else. There's a lot of potential still to build resilient coffee production in most of the coffee lands. But that means we have to start thinking about it and acting on it now. It means we can't continue to just sort of hope for the best and kick the can down the road. We need to begin to review how things need to change at the level of farm practices, how things need to change at the level of producer organization practices and strategies, how things need to change for exporters in terms of their strategies and practices, and what roasters can do from the consumption end of the supply chain to incentivize and support the uptake of more climate resilient practices. So the first thing we need to understand, and this is the focus more or less of this webinar, is what's the actual effect? So how is climate going to affect the regions from which I source over the next several decades? And understanding that some of those effects will occur now or in the short term, and some of those effects will become evident in the mid to long term. So in general, and here we're going to dig into with quite a bit of detail into the case of Honduras, just to give you an idea, and then I'll show some results from other countries as well. But in general, what we're talking about is temperatures that are going to rise and precipitation that is going to vary. So here you can see the upper right-hand corner, the map of Honduras showing the projected temperature increases. And you can see, again, it varies across the country, but there are going to be some pretty significant increases. Coffee, unlike other agricultural crops, has a fairly narrow window, Arabica in particular, a fairly narrow window temperature-wise in which it can perform well. So any change in temperature begins to negatively affect both the productivity of the coffee plant and also its quality. So there are issues there that will definitely have implications for the coffee sector. And secondly, the lower right-hand side, you can see projected changes in precipitation. And these are both total precipitation over the year, but also, as the graph in the middle shows, precipitation as is distributed during the calendar year. So this means that some months may become wetter, some months may become drier. In general, temperature will increase, but there's quite a bit of variability at the micro scale. So what we need to do are start to build strategies that allow us to get in front of these issues and begin to think about, okay, if temperatures in general are increasing, what can we do to reduce temperatures? If rainfall is becoming more erratic, what can we do in some regions to focus on water harvesting and more efficient water use? And in other regions, think about not only that, but potential ways to deal with excess rainfall. So the conceptual approach we use to come up with these kind of tools and models is the following. So coffee is currently produced under a specific set of climatic conditions. We can understand those climatic conditions by mapping where coffee currently is produced and produced well. And then we can apply a big data approach called machine learning, which combines complex climate data, can fill in some of the gaps for missing climate data, can help to model how this will affect coffee. But there are some issues, there are some limits there in terms of the physiological model of how coffee actually functions. Those models are insufficient and underdeveloped. And there's also a very high level of uncertainty in terms of precipitation projections. And partially this has to do with just the modeling error, because most of these precipitation and global climate models are done at a global scale. And so downscaling them to make sense at a country or even a subnational level generates additional error. But we'll take a look at that as we go forward. So with this kind of a conceptual approach, we go ahead and, in the case of Honduras, map where coffee is currently produced. You can see both the Arabica production currently and the protected areas in the country. And then we take a look at a series of bioclimatic variables. I'll be quizzing you on all of these at the end, so I hope you're taking notes. But you can see principally they're clustered into temperature and precipitation variables. And the idea is these are the variables that are the most relevant, we feel, at least in terms of the coffee, coffee productivity and coffee quality. These are then put into what are called decision trees using an approach called random forests, which again is a big data driven approach, where effectively what we develop are a range of these decision trees that allow us to understand whether or not coffee is or isn't present. And this is based initially on the existence of coffee, where coffee is grown currently. So we're able to train the model based on current coffee distribution. And then we're able to generate a range of these different decision trees into the future based on different climate projections. And so effectively the random forest model is then able to go ahead and tell us whether or not, given the projected future climate in any given place or point on the map, is it high or low probability that coffee will be able to be produced there. The output that we use is the mean classification. And in general, this approach is very robust to overfitting. So it doesn't tend to exaggerate or overfit the data, unlike other statistical approaches. And that's as far as I'm going to get with statistics today. So we can stop on that if anyone's head feels like it's going to explode. So what this gives us then are things like this. These are the current Arabica suitability zones for Honduras. And you can see there are different areas and different climatic conditions under which Arabica is produced. So we range from the top with dry, hot, and long dry seasons down to the bottom where we have wet, cool, and short dry seasons. And you can see there's a range of areas that are viable currently for coffee. And then you can see areas that are mixed, marginal, and unsuitable. If we project that then into 2050, again, with using the climate models, what we see are these changes. Now, what we've shown here are the areas that, again, continue to be viable for or suitable for Arabica production in 2050. And on the bottom right-hand side, you can see the confidence of the climate model. And this is important because you can see that there are areas where the multiple models are very consistent and there's a high level of confidence. Those are the darker blues. And then you can see areas that are lighter and into reds where there's a lower level of confidence in the modeling results, simply because, as I mentioned before, downscaling from global circulation models to more site-specific approaches tends to lead to disagreement among the models. So that's partially what we're seeing here. And so what we've tried to do as a research center at CIAT is try to put this into a user interface that's understandable. And so we've come up with these kind of maps, where what we've done is we've taken the level of climate change and the level of the model confidence, and we've identified areas where we feel, based on that and to the best of our knowledge and ability, we will see different kinds of adaptation taking place. So some areas green, where we'll see incremental adaptation, some areas that are yellow, where we'll see systemic adaptation, and some areas of red where we'll see transformational adaptation. And what that means is the following. Incremental adaptation are areas where climate will probably remain suitable for coffee through 2050. So yes, we need to implement good agricultural practices. Yes, we need to think about proper management and proper post-harvest and proper investment in the coffee crop. But in general, these areas will be able to continue to produce coffee into 2050. Yes, they need support. Yes, they need investment, but they're going to continue to produce coffee. Systemic adaptation areas are the yellow areas. And these are areas where climate most likely will remain suitable, but there will be increased stress, whether that's excess rainfall or lack of rainfall or excess temperature varies somewhat by region. But these stresses can be managed, but require a comprehensive change in practices, both at the farm level and also in terms of strategy and enablers from other actors in the value chain. And then the areas that are marked as red on the map are what we consider transformational adaptation zones. And these are areas that by 2050 will most likely need to migrate out of coffee. That doesn't mean they need to migrate out of coffee today. It doesn't mean they need to migrate out of coffee in the next decade even. But they should begin to think about what are other options beyond coffee, because increasingly they will find that it's difficult to produce coffee because of either heat or rainfall or lack of rainfall. And effectively, they need to start identifying other viable crops. Some of this is already happening. Those of you who work in Central America, for example, in Nicaragua, in Honduras, actually in some areas of Peru, in some areas of Africa as well, you begin to see lower altitudes where people are actively exploring other opportunities such as cocoa or cacao, citrus, maybe avocados, whatever other crops people feel are better suited for the future climate. So these are the kind of things that we'll begin to see. So I wanted that's just to gives you a general overview of how the maps are developed and how you can understand them. And now I just want to share with you maps from a few other countries, because I know that many people on the call are probably saying, well, yeah, I source from Honduras, but I also source from other countries. So just to give you a flavor of the other maps that are available or are under development. So here we have, for example, Guatemala. And again, here you can see that Guatemala, unlike, for example, Honduras, or certainly unlike El Salvador and Nicaragua, is fairly well positioned going forward simply because of altitude. So there are areas of areas of Guatemala, that will clearly be affected by climate change. But in general, the areas important for coffee production will remain mostly viable going forward. So Guatemala is in a relatively better position than, for example, Honduras, and certainly better than Nicaragua and El Salvador in Central America for these kind of changes. We'll be developing a Guatemala country brief, and I'll talk about the Honduras country brief in a second, probably towards the end of this year with a lot more detail. El Salvador, here the color scheme's a bit off. You'll have to excuse me. The purple is a transform. But nonetheless, you can see that El Salvador has some areas, as a much larger area that we expect to transform out of coffee. And again, this has implications in terms of where you're sourcing and what you might want to do. Then if we look at Nicaragua, we can see, again, significant changes in Nicaragua. Again, there are areas that will be able to continue to produce coffee, but it's going to require significant continued investment in technologies that are adapted to higher temperatures and more erratic rainfall. So some of that's already happening. I know there have been introductions of different varieties in Nicaragua, specifically adapted to increased temperatures. And so there are certain things that can be done, but this is what the situation looks like if we just continue to produce with the current varieties we have. And then moving to Africa, here's Uganda, and Uganda is a bit different because here we have both Robusta and Arabica. And you can see that Robusta has a much broader area of where it's well adapted currently. And as we move forward to 2050, you can see that that even the Arabica becomes much more challenged in terms of where it grows. And if we put it into this the color scheme we've been using, these are the kind of things you see for Uganda. So relatively smaller areas of production for the Arabica, principally Mount Elgon, and then the northwest, a little bit down on the border with Tanzania as well. But this is principally what you see for the case of Uganda. We'll be developing country briefs for Honduras, Guatemala, Uganda, and Tanzania. And so those will be forthcoming. The Uganda, Honduras, and Guatemala country briefs should be forthcoming this year. So what can we do again with this kind of climate projection? The first thing is remember to do no harm. So I use the image here of the medical profession simply to say that there are many things that we're already doing that we should continue to do. So good agricultural practices are a good investment. Helping farmers understand how they can effectively rehabilitate or renovate their crops is a good idea. Strengthening producer organizations and building them as viable business partners continues to be a good investment. Working with your peers in multi-stakeholder platforms or in coffee programs at the national scale makes sense. Supporting national coffee programs in terms of breeding and getting access to more resistant varieties in terms of climate makes sense. Working with organizations globally like World Coffee Research that are investing in new variety development makes sense. All of these things that are ongoing should continue. We're not talking about completely changing everything. What we're talking about doing is understanding where we want to invest, for what, and under what conditions. So to help guide that process, we're developing a series of country briefs that include, in addition to the climate maps I've shown, a bunch of other information. And this is just a quick snapshot of what's in the Honduras country brief. So it's got general information of coffee in Honduras. The data here needs to be updated. And I know that the total production in Honduras now is much higher, but it gives a sense of what's coffee like in the country, how important is it to the country, how many people are employed in the sector in the country, how does the country stack up against its neighbors in terms of coffee production, what are the different ways of producing coffee, the different production systems, what are the effects in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of those systems. And it also provides a lot of additional information in terms of the sector in the country, what are the policies from the government, what are innovative activities being put forward by different actors in the private sector, what are some of the potentials for investment and ways to mitigate the effects of climate change on the country, and also what are some of the strategies that are already going forward in the country, either from the public sector, from international donors, or from the private sector, with whom you might think about partnering. So it attempts to be sort of I won't say a one-stop shop, but it tries to put together a lot of currently very dispersed information into one document that we hope will be a useful reference for all of you. In addition to the longer version of these documents, which are going to be probably 10 to 15 pages, there will be a short set of infographics that allow people to get a very quick overview of what's happening in the specific origin in terms of coffee production. So in terms of climate smart agriculture, what are we talking about? I know this was shown in the last slide, in the last presentation, but effectively I just want to highlight this. Climate smart agriculture is not necessarily starting from scratch. What it's doing is taking agricultural practices that have positive effects on yield, that have positive effects on quality, right? That may have positive effects on reducing the use of inputs or reducing the use of water, and puts a climate lens on them. So what that means in practice is it allows you to understand which practices to implement where, more or less when, and what kind of return on investment to expect. So it's not that we have to completely reinvent the wheel. So I want to be very clear about that, but it is important that we incorporate the idea of climate change and climate resilience into our decision making. It makes very little sense to focus, for example, processes of renovation in areas that are going to be really, really hard hit by climate change. These are areas that would be better suited to think about transitioning out of coffee and into other crops, and maybe we want to focus our renovation efforts or our rehabilitation efforts on the yellow and the green zones. So I think it's just understanding how we differentiate spatially the kind of activities we want to implement. And the other thing that's important here is to understand that as climate change doesn't have a specific, it doesn't have a uniform effect geographically, nor does it have a uniform effect temporally over time. It also tends to not have uniform effects on producers and on households. So people who tend to be disproportionately affected by these changes in climate and the more erratic rainfall or temperature changes tend to be those more vulnerable to begin with. So we need to start thinking about who are our suppliers. We need to start understanding how are they capable of responding or not to these changes, what kind of practices need to be implemented, but also what kind of strategies or enablers can be provided by others in the value chain to assist producers in adapting and adopting these practices to become more resilient over time. So I think it's very important to understand that while we see climate change having direct impacts and visible impacts at the farm level, it's a problem that affects us all. Anyone who's engaged in the coffee business needs to be thinking about how they, from their position in the value chain, can support changes that are going to build the resilience of the overall coffee production and coffee processing, exporting, and marketing ecosystem. We're all part of the problem, we're all part of the solution. So my plea to all of you is to not assume that only farmers need to change. So if we break this down a bit further, we can talk about three things that need to happen. Clearly, we need to identify and implement practices at the farm scale, and here's just a few very simple examples that allow farmers to adapt to current climate variability and begin to prepare to some extent for future climate change. Okay, these are the practices that we need to be incentivizing, we need to be supporting, and we need to be promoting amongst the farmers with whom we work. And then beyond that, beyond the farm gate, we need to be talking about strategies. And these strategies may be implemented by the producer organization, the community, actors in the supply chain, but effectively they're beginning to look a bit longer term. And they're beginning to think, and these strategies help us begin to think about things like diversification. You know, where and when and how do we want to begin to diversify in coffee regions that will be significantly impacted by climate change? What are those options? If it's not coffee, what are the crops? How do we identify additional buyers? How do we crowd them in? Can we make use of existing producer organizations and social capital to access those markets? What additional skills are needed? Another strategy clearly is choosing resilient varieties. What are those varieties? Are they available? Do they meet our quality needs? Can farmers access them? At what cost? How do we promote the renovation of existing coffee varieties that may be less well suited for those that are better suited? Yeah. A third area is how do we begin to change processing methods? So if we're working in areas that are going to be increasingly water stressed going forward, how do we begin to invest much more effort in promoting low water use processing, right? How do we begin to work again on the wet milling, but using the ecological wet milling that we've seen emerge certainly in Colombia as well as in Central America and also recently in Africa? How do we promote these kind of approaches that effectively are better stewards of water, not only for the coffee producer and the wet mill, but also for the broader community? How do we explore other options in terms of processing? And this, again, I'm not an expert in different aspects of drying and fermentation and whatnot, but what else can we do? And how can those processing methods allow us to be more resilient and deal better with changes in temperature and changes in rainfall? And then finally, they're enablers. And these enablers are very, very important. These enablers principally come from actors who are able to establish or support the conditions needed to implement climate-smart agricultural practices and to adopt them. Obviously, financing is a big question here. How can we leverage and how can we channel financing so that people can effectively invest in climate resilient practices? And there are multiple ways to do this. Currently, there's the coffee sector, I would say along with cocoa and a few others, has a very robust financial engine, if you will, attached to it. But principally the financing that's currently built into the coffee sector, which tends to be around trade finance, managed oftentimes by impact investors, focuses on underwriting commercial transactions. It struggles a lot more, despite very strong efforts by colleagues at Root Capital and elsewhere, it struggles in identifying and developing longer term investments, particularly in terms of climate resilience. So there's a tremendous need in the financing space to begin to identify more creative blended capital approaches where we can make use of commercial capital, but also make use of donor funding and, and sort of, I would say, low cost capital to extend different kinds of financing mechanisms that effectively allow producers and producer organizations to make the investments needed over time to build resilience. Another topic, another kind of enabler are things like weather insurance, or just in general, any kind of risk reduction. So here we're talking about weather in particular, but risk reduction in terms of price variability would also be very important, because these things allow people to reinvest in their systems, and they allow producer organizations to function in a more stable environment. Anything that reduces the commercial or weather risk of agriculture is probably helpful in building the resilience of the system. The use of weather stations and better data management and access to weather data to better plan what practices to implement where and when is obviously needed. And these are the kind of things where we're beginning to see the emergence of things like Kukua in Africa, which was rolling out weather stations in many parts of the continent, and other parts, and certainly Ana Café has done some of this in Guatemala as well, trying to drive weather information down to farmers in ways that help to improve their decision making, so that if they're going to apply fertilizer, they want to make sure that the fertilizer that they apply will be used by the plant, because the rain pattern is appropriate, and it's not either going to be applied to the plant and there will be no rain, or applied to the plant and there will be torrential rains and they'll lose that investment. And then finally, the question around innovations in business models and payment terms to promote climate smart practices. What can we do from a purchasing perspective? We have a strong experience. We have a strong track record in the coffee market, particularly in specialty, paying for quality and incentivizing quality. Okay, there's been a lot of creativity and innovation shown in how to incentivize quality year on year, and how that can lead to sustained investments and reinvestment by farmers in their production systems. How can we take what we've learned from that and apply it to things like climate resilience? How can we begin to incentivize practices that not only contribute to improved quality, but also contribute to improved resilience? How can we begin to untangle the nexus or the connection between quality and resilience, quality and good agricultural practices? How can we begin to apply additional approaches, data-driven approaches, to really understand what makes sense where and when, and then incentivize that? And clearly, as I mentioned, these practices, strategies, and enablers are going to vary by the kind of climate effect we're looking at. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to give you a sense. So depending on where you are, these are the ways that some of the climate smart practices, strategies, and enablers may vary. You can see clearly in the green area, it's much more good agricultural practice and much more transparent management. Systemic change now brings in additional issues around diversification, processing, maybe beginning to look at things like crop insurance, access to finance, carbon insetting, a few other options. And then transformative change means probably moving to additional crops, or to Robusta if we're going to stay in coffee, or to other crops. And then the question is, how much of that transformative change can be built on the existing coffee infrastructure that already exists, and how much can be invested in or supported by the coffee sector, and how much needs to be picked up by other buyers and or by the public sector. So that's one way to look at it. This is another way to look at it. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but these are the kind of things that we see as potential practices, strategies, and enablers for farmers, producer organizations, coffee traders, and roasters, for example, in areas of incremental change. So here we're talking about things that are relatively, areas that are going to be relatively, less affected or less impacted by climate, but nonetheless, we need to make investments. And we have a whole additional webinar that digs into this in a lot more detail. Systemic change, again, you can see here things change quite a bit, and we begin to start talking about other kinds of practices, strategies, and enablers. One of the things I would highlight here is the importance of risk reduction in all of these scenarios. And that risk reduction comes down to both risk, climate risk, but also market risk. And so the understanding how we can de-risk to the extent possible coffee production and thus incentivize investment or reinvestment in coffee is really, really important, particularly from the perspective of the buyer or from the roaster. And then you have sort of some ideas of what will happen in transformative change. And again, there'll be a future webinar where we take this apart and look at it in much more detail. So in terms of some quick conclusions, just to wrap up here, I think there's some very basic takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. First of all, we need to start acting on this now. Climate change, while the maps project things out to 2050 and the models talk about 2050, the effects of climate change are here and now. We need to start investing and we need to start incentivizing practices, strategies, and enablers that allow the entire value chain to begin to build in more resilient practices. And the sooner we do it, the less expensive and the easier it's going to be. The longer we put this off, the longer we kick the can down the road thinking that, well, maybe this will or won't affect me, the more expensive and the more difficult it's going to be to make the changes that need to happen. Secondly, there's a need to combine the kinds of exposure maps and the kinds of information that we've been developing as part of the Alliance for Resilient Coffee with business incentives. We can have lots of information on the projected climate change. We can have lots of information on the practices by exposure gradient. We can have lots of information about all of the things that need to happen. But if we don't tie those practices to incentives to actually support people making the changes, yeah, and that means that they have knowledge about what needs to change, what they need to do. They have access to information, technology, support, training to actually implement the change that needs to happen. And then they have recourse to people who can actually help them sort out problems, because normally when we do something new, one or more things don't work. So those three things need to be in place, and they need to be in place in a stable environment. So making noise about wanting to incentivize one practice this year and then forgetting about it for 3 years isn't going to work. We need to maintain a clear set of signals and incentives along the value chain that effectively build resilience. And those should be based on scientific insights that identify what practices where, at what cost, and under what conditions, for whom. Those are the things that we need to do together. Again, if it's not already clear, I'll say it again, partnerships are very important. I don't think it's feasible for any one actor in the coffee supply chain to solve any of the issues we've been discussing on their own. We need to work together. The coffee chain in general has a strong track record of collaboration, a strong track record of knowledge sharing and of coordination. That's really important, but we need to build on that. And we need to really go well beyond where we are now in terms of these partnerships if we want to become effective at dealing with the problem we're facing at the scale we're facing. And finally, just a health warning. Resilience is not something that we can decree. It's not something that we can just automatically pull out our magic wand and magically tomorrow everybody's resilient. No. It's something we build towards, as the same way that you would build a trusted relationship with a series of suppliers, and that requires multiple interactions over multiple years with benefits for all sides. Resilience is the same thing. We need to build multiple interventions over multiple years, and things are going to come together over time. We cannot and we should not expect resilience to be solved and climate adaptation to be solved in 1 year. And particularly in a crop like coffee, which is clearly a long-term perennial crop where some of the investments we make this year may not show results for a year or even 2. So we need to take a long-term view, and we need to understand that we're building resilience over a longer term. So that's what I have to share with you. And just in conclusion quickly, that we're going to be having a following webinar focused on how you can manage the effects of climate change in your supply chain. That's coming up in the future. And we also have a series of resources that that are included in the presentation for those of you who would like to read additional information about this. And you have our emails, myself and my colleague Christian Bunn at the bottom, and we're happy to take any of your questions either now in the webinar or also in the future via email. Here's the calendar of the next modules. And so you can see the next one is going to be June 28th, focused on tools. And with that, I will say thank you and hand back over to Caroline.
Thanks, Mark. Wow, I'm most amazed, and I'm always scared when I see those maps and I see coffee disappearing. But I thank you also for showing that climate smart agriculture has also positive effects, because often we heard that it has negative effects, especially on yield. But no, I think we have to, as you said, think about long-term here, that it has positive effects on yield and quality. And I also thank you for showing us or giving us a glimpse on how climate change looks in practice by giving examples from practices, strategies, and enablers. Yeah, there is an urgency in this topic, but as you said, don't panic. That's why we're here for. We're bringing this learning series to everyone to make people understand what the threats are, but then also in the next tool or the next module, we'll show more the tools that can be used. But I would like to open the floor now to questions. We already have a few questions, so please raise your hand if you want to contribute directly. Or some of your experiences or questions, you can either raise your hand or please put them into the question and answer box, which you should be able to see. And there is one first question I would like to hand over to you, Mark, which says, is there any work being developed in hydroponic coffee production? I hope you can do something with that.
Wow, I do not have complete knowledge of everything happening in coffee research or the coffee sector. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of anything going on in hydroponic coffee research. There may well be, but I'm not aware of it. And again, I guess my response to that is I think these kind of solutions would be interesting, but I struggle to see how they would be applied at the scale that we actually need in terms of number of producers and in terms of volume of coffee. I didn't include it in this presentation, but all of you from the industry are well aware that we're in a situation where coffee demand and consumption continues to increase, of which I'm happy, and I'm happy to contribute as much as I can. But at the same time, we need to increase coffee production to keep up with demand. And I don't know if we could roll out a solution like hydroponics at the scale needed to do that in coffee, quite frankly, at least not with the current crop of coffee producers we have. I don't know. Does anyone else? Kate, you want to take a whack at that one?
I have no idea the answer to the question if there is any work being developed in that area, but I think your question kind of speaks to the need for more research and development and looking into long-term solutions. Maybe the hydroponics is not the exact solution, but in the next module, at the end of this month, we will have World Coffee Research presenting on some of the research that they're doing around resilient varieties, and this might be a good question for them.
Yep.
So there's another question which asked, so it says, nice presentation so far, so thank you. How do you evaluate climate data gaps and quality in African countries in relation to coffee production, for example, Uganda and Tanzania?
Well, I think in general, so data gaps are a problem globally when you talk about tropical agriculture. So what we're doing here is attempting to use so there's several pieces to the puzzle. So what we're doing here is we're using global circulation models to project climate change into the future but we're also, where available, trying to build in the existing, for example, the data from Honduras showed the last 30 years of precipitation and temperature data. So where available, we try to build both of those pieces in. Having said that, in many countries, and certainly East Africa in general, Uganda and Tanzania are no exception, has a relative lack of this kind of consistent data, at least at the scale and at the resolution that we would like to see. So in that case, we do the best we can with the data we have available. But in many cases, there are significant data gaps in terms of recent weather data weather data sets. Again, if anyone on the call has access to significant weather data sets, particularly from coffee production regions, that they would be willing to share and have anonymized and used in these models, we would be most happy to incorporate them. In many countries, it's difficult to get that data, and so we have to rely more on the model data.
Thank you. There is another question. Thanking again for the good presentation. I thought it was a really good and clarifying presentation. How do you decide on which countries to start the countries' briefs and maps? So I think she's referring to the country briefs.
Yeah. So basically, what we have is these country briefs. They're two pieces of work. So both of which have been funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. So there will be regional briefs for Central America and for East Africa, and then there will be specific country briefs under the Alliance for Resilient Coffee for Honduras, Guatemala, Tanzania, and Uganda. And that basically comes down to the negotiations with in this case with USAID. We have also done significant additional work in Peru. And we have done some initial additional work in Indonesia and in Vietnam. Certainly, these kind of briefs and these kinds of detailed maps could be developed for any coffee producing country globally, but it comes down to the question of resources to do so. So that's where the conversation stands right now. I'm hopeful that if these examples are seen to be as useful by the coffee sector and actually help people improve their decision making, that maybe collectively we can find a way to roll them out to a greater number of key coffee producing countries. But right now, those are the ones we have slated and funds to develop.
Thank you. So there are no more questions right now. I do have a question myself, Mark. I learned that the solutions for addressing climate change varies from region to region, and I dare say within a country. So in what depth are these climate maps available? Does it really go into various regions of a country, or is it on a higher level?
That's a great question. So I would say in general, the maps are useful at a national and maybe down to a departmental or provincial level. The reason we hesitate to go beyond that is because since we use multiple global circulation models, the level of agreement begins to become quite erratic as you move down to smaller and smaller scales. And the technical reason for that is principally because the size of the pixels they use in these maps are usually 10 by 10 kilometer squares. So it's quite a large area. And so as you get into smaller and smaller detail, the variance between the different models gets large, and it becomes very difficult to make sense of them. So we prefer to use them at the national and at the subnational sort of departmental or provincial scale. Having said that, there are things that can be done at a much finer, more local scale, and I think we'll be discussing those in some of the future webinars, and certainly some of the work that HRNS has been doing with their on-farm data collection and management would help answer some of those questions. Again, one of the challenges we have going forward, and one that we're actively working on in Uganda in coffee and in Ghana and cocoa, is also beginning to build into this whole process the implementations of localized weather stations. So how can you begin then to tie this long-term, sort of the last 30 years of data of temperature and rainfall with the model projections out to 2050 with real-time climate data coming in from weather stations in the regions. And that I think when we can begin to get all those ducks in a row and begin to line things up in ways that make sense. So you can say, okay, this is where the climate models say we're going. The last 30 years of data show us this for this region, and the data we're getting from a specific weather station that covers the region shows us these kind of trends. Then you can begin to identify, I think, in a much finer way, the practice, the very, very specific practices that are most useful in a region. But there are two gaps we have right now for that. One is just data availability. So in general, this kind of data is not available. Certainly rainfall and temperature data at a very specific localized scale is still difficult to get at the quality we would like to see. And secondly, you just don't have, the lack of data availability also speaks to the fact that there just aren't enough weather stations out there. So again, these are the kind of things where we're piloting with coffee companies in Uganda, for example, this kind of work where the coffee companies are helping to put in the weather station, and we're trying to align methods and tools that allow us to get much finer analysis. But I think that's still probably, I would say 2 to 3 years out before we have anything really robust that we'd be comfortable sharing. It may be up to 5 years depending on how complicated it gets.
Thank you, Mark. Meanwhile, 4 more questions have come in, and we'll see that we get them all answered. So thank you for the presentation. From your experience in the field, how do you see the influence of the common certification schemes like UTZ Rainforest Alliance, Fairtrade, in fostering climate-smart agriculture?
That's a great question. I think, again, the coffee sector, along with a few others, I mean, certainly cacao and a few others, where you have sort of these parallel, I would say parallel, almost sort of meso level interventions, one of them being certification, the other being sort of impact investing, present unique opportunities. I think in general, the certification agencies have done a good job in promoting the uptake of certain practices. Clearly, there's variation between rainforest UTZ, which is now the same thing, and fair trade or flow standards in terms of what they promote in terms of practices. But what I would say in all cases is that these standards generally promote blanket approaches or blanket practices across all of their certified farms. And if there's one thing that I hope I've showed from the maps and from the presentation, climate change doesn't work that way. Climate change is, it's both temporally and spatially distinct. And so we actually, while those practices that are included in the certification schemes may well be valid, we need to overlay on that a climate lens to understand which practices to prioritize where, and which practices, and those are going to vary, right? And what are the expected results of those practices? So, I mean, I think that's very, very important. The other piece that's really important, and I'll channel my colleagues from IITA in Africa on this one, is also unpacking some of the best practice packages into pieces that are actually implementable for the farmers we're working with. So many farmers in Africa, particularly coffee farmers in Africa, are not don't talk about coffee in hectares or they talk about coffee in number of trees, and they talk about cherries in a number of kilos of cherries and so when you start talking about coffee at that level, you need to really unpack some of these practices that are promoted not only by certification agencies and others into bite-sized pieces that small farmers can actually implement given their resource constraints. And so there's a real need to I think, for the certification bodies to do 2 things. One, understand that the climate change is spatially and temporally variable, and therefore some of the certification practices that are promoted might need to vary as well. And 2, think about how these certification practices can respond to the different resource constraints that different kinds of farmers have. So it's understanding the spatial and temporal variation, and also understanding the farmer segmentation or the farmer differentiation to really begin to make the most effective use of this tremendous resource that are the certification networks that exist in the coffee sector.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We have another question here from Nestor Meneses from GCP in Honduras. He says, more of the changes or actions that are needed need to influence national policies. Do you think that there's enough participation of national authorities? For example, in Honduras, eCafe is not a government institution.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, again, this comes down to the political economy of coffee in different countries. Clearly in Honduras, coffee is very important in the national economy. So clearly there's a role for the national government to play. The question then becomes, how does the national government, or eCafe in particular, how do eCafe and the national government reach an agreement about what needs to happen and who needs to do what and who invests in what? Again, I would hope that the coffee sector, taking a step back from just the case of Honduras and thinking about this more generally, I would hope that the coffee sector could take a proactive role in facilitating conversations and trying to get as much alignment as possible between national coffee institutes like eCafe, the Ministry of Agriculture in Honduras, international donors who may be investing in coffee, and try to work and try to collaborate or develop spaces where we can actually have dialogue about what needs to happen where and how we can begin to prioritize different kinds of investments based on the needs and potential of the sector in a country. For the most part, although there are intents to do that, I would say that has been not as effective as I would like to see. Again, it's not only Honduras. I think it's common across many countries. But I think that's something that collectively we need to start to promote. How can we get better collective action and better collaboration among the coffee institutes, the private sector actors, the producer organizations, the public sector, the government, and really begin to align donor agencies internationally, and really begin to align our efforts around a common strategy. So these national platforms, the coffee platforms, are really important in that regard, and something that definitely need to be promoted and strengthened going forward. So, I mean, I think that's where collectively we need to put a lot more activity, or a lot more attention, I guess, Kate. Or Nestor via Kate, I should say.
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to take the next question? Bring that forward.
Sure, yeah. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we have a question from Kirsten Lynn on the call. She says, thanks, Mark. I have seen and worked with these suitability maps since 2008 and find them great as a sensitization tool. But when working with farmers, the socioeconomic dimension, in my experience, becomes more and more important. And you kind of referenced this already, but is there a model that includes or projects the socioeconomic impacts of climate change on the farmers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I mentioned it a little bit earlier that our colleagues at IITA in Uganda and Tanzania, and to a lesser degree Rwanda, and also in West Africa for cocoa in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, are working precisely on that, because I would say that's really what's needed. So yes, we need to understand the climatic changes and what does that mean for the coffee tree itself, yeah. But then we also need to really begin to dig into and understand the different socioeconomic variation we have among the farmers we work with. And so it's very, very important to begin to understand that. And I think this is a kind of deep knowledge of the value chain that we really need to begin to develop. And and in some cases, depending on the business model of the roaster, you may have some of that. If you're a roaster that engages, really deeply in direct trade models, you may have a sense of what the socioeconomic situation is of your producer, or the producer organization that you're working with, or the producers that you're working with. Some traders have made significant investments in trying to understand and track some of these issues, to understand where to invest and how to invest and what kind of return they can expect on investments in different kinds of farmers. But I think collectively we need to get a lot better at this, and we need to understand that that there's a need for additional coffee production going forward. And a lot of that additional coffee production going forward probably is not going to come from the larger producers we have now unless they radically expand their area. So we need to become a lot more effective, I think, at working with some of the the mid to smaller producers and really bringing them up. And that means understanding their socioeconomic constraints and how we can help enable the changes we need to see from them in order to really step up and play a much stronger role in the coffee production system globally. It's not easy, and it's often very site specific and very knowledge intensive. But these are the kind of things that as a researcher, we're certainly very, very interested in engaging with and think are critical in order to make the kind of changes we're proposing stick and effectively lead to the kind of outcomes we're hoping to achieve.
Great, thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.
Caroline, I think you're still on mute. It looks like you're.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Kate. I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. Mark, if you could do me a favor and go one slide back.
Sure.
So this has been very exciting. And if there are more questions, please, by all means, do drop us an email. So today we finished the second module. The next one is on in 2 weeks, on a Thursday again, on June 28th. We will be sharing this presentation as well as the recording on our website. So once you receive this presentation, all these items here are linked for more information and registration, or the ones that have been done where you can see the recordings and the presentations if you like. If you need general information, just click on the link on the bottom and you will find all the details of the learning series there. So we hope to see you again on June 28th. The time stays the same. So in the States, it's 9 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast, and in Europe, it's 3 o'clock on Europe mainland. And I would like to thank you very much again, Mark Lundy. I think all the questions said, great presentation. It's been really good to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. We hope to continue to work with everyone on further making these scary maps actionable and useful, so that they don't just scare people to death, but we can actually do something with them and move towards action. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. And with that, I say goodbye to everyone and hope to see you on June 28th.